Welcome to Crisis in Perception,
Mm.
where we examine the systems actively shaping our world and our future.
And the invisible structures that we kind of just take for granted every single day.
Exactly. I'm so glad you're here listening to this because we have a really intense deep dive for you today.
We really do.
Like, if you hop on a rocket to Mars tomorrow, your biggest threat isn't actually the rocket exploding on the launch pad.
Right, which is what everyone assumes.
Yeah, or like a micrometeoroid puncturing the hull.
Mhm.
If you survive the journey, your biggest threats are actually your own spine dissolving inside your body, the Martian dirt actively suffocating you, and your corporate boss legally owning the air you breathe.
It is a profound reality check because we are so accustomed to looking at the stars through this lens of pure technological triumph.
Oh, totally.
And because of that, we become entirely blind to the biological and, well, the socio-technical nightmare waiting for us out in the vacuum.
Yes, and I want you, the person listening to this right now, to just throw out everything you think you know about space settlement.
Just clear the slate entirely.
Because today we are looking at a massive, overarching mission. This theme we call Crisis in Perception. We are examining what happens when our boundless technological ambition completely outruns our highly fragile biological reality.
Which is really the defining tension of our era. I mean, entire civilizations are preparing to leave Earth.
Right, both public and private sectors.
Exactly. They are preparing to expand outward without actually knowing if the human animal can physically survive once it arrives.
And the grounding foundation for this entire deep dive, the meticulously researched source we are unpacking today, is this incredible book called The City on Mars by
Yeah.
Kelly Weinersmith and Zach Weinersmith.
It's a fantastic source.
It really is. And let me tell you, this book completely dismantles the dominant public narrative we all carry around in our heads.
Because if we connect this to the bigger picture, the public narrative right now frames leaving Earth and colonizing Mars as a purely technological milestone.
Like, it's just a matter of time and engineering.
Right. It is treated almost exclusively as an engineering timeline. The perception is simple if we can just figure out the thrust-to-weight ratio of the heavy-lift launch vehicle.
If we just build the reusable rockets.
Exactly. If we construct the 3D-printed habitats, then we succeed.
It's this incredibly seductive, clean narrative. Like, just give the engineers enough budget, let them finalize the blueprints for the life support modules,
Yeah.
and we'll see you in a thriving metropolis on Olympus Mons.
But what this deep dive reveals is that this exact framing is a fundamental crisis in perception.
How so?
Because the limiting factors for becoming a multiplanetary civilization are not machines, they aren't rocket engines or structural carbon fiber.
Right?
The real roadblocks are highly complex, deeply unstable socio-technical systems.
We're talking about the fact that human biology is fundamentally tethered to the precise gravity and atmospheric pressure of a single planet.
Exactly. And we are talking about incredibly volatile microecosystems that can just collapse overnight.
And perhaps most dangerously, we are talking about woefully incomplete international legal frameworks.
Oh, the legal side is terrifying.
It really is. And monopolistic economic structures that are going to dictate how humans actually live, work, and die in the void.
It is a massive structural problem, not an engineering challenge. You cannot solve a biological or geopolitical crisis simply by building a bigger rocket.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to truly understand just how incredibly flawed this engineering-only mindset is, we have to start with the most immediate, inescapable physical
The
reality.
human body.
Yes, the absolute undeniable frailty of the human machine. The plain truth is, the human body was simply not built for space. Period.
And what's fascinating here is how fundamentally we as a public misunderstand what being in space actually means for the physical body.
Totally.
Like when you see footage of astronauts on the International Space Station, they look serene. They look like they are just peacefully floating in a zero-gravity void.
Right. That's the exact image everyone has.
Yeah.
Just floating around, doing somersaults, drinking little water bubbles out of the air.
But from a physics perspective, that isn't what's happening at all.
No.
No. The International Space Station is only about 250 miles above the Earth. And at that altitude, the Earth's gravitational pull is still about 90% as strong as it is on the surface.
Wait, really? 90%.
Yes. They aren't in zero gravity at all. They are in a perpetual state of free fall.
This is one of those physics concepts that just breaks your brain a little bit until you really visualize it.
It really does.
It's like being on the drop of a massive roller coaster, but the drop never, ever ends.
That's a perfect analogy.
Because to stay in orbit,
Yeah.
the station is moving sideways at about 17,500 miles per hour. So it is constantly falling toward the Earth because of that 90% gravity.
Right.
But it's moving sideways so incredibly fast that the surface of the Earth essentially just curves away out from under it.
It keeps falling and it keeps missing the ground. It is a continuous, never-ending ballistic trajectory. And while the mathematics of that are beautiful, your biological body absolutely hates it.
It truly deeply hates it. The immediate reaction is profound confusion.
Because of the inner ear.
Exactly. Your inner ear, which relies on fluid and these tiny little hairs to tell your brain which way is down, suddenly just starts sending panic signals. It says, we are falling. We are constantly falling.
And in the short term, this continuous free fall sensation induces extreme space motion sickness.
This is awful nausea.
Severe nausea, disorientation, vomiting. Usually that passes after a few days as the brain essentially gives up and just starts ignoring the signals from the inner ear entirely.
But the immediate discomfort is nothing compared to the long-term physiological degradation.
That is where the real structural problems begin for the concept of prominent settlement.
It is genuinely alarming when you dig into the mechanics of it. Like, let's talk about the skeleton.
A very fragile structure, it turns out.
Very. When you are walking around on Earth, going about your daily life, from the perspective of your skeletal system, you're basically just picking up your heavy body and slamming it down against gravity over and over again.
Right.
And your body, as it turns out, is an extreme biological cheapskate. It operates on a ruthlessly strict use-it-or-lose-it basis.
That is a highly accurate way to look at it. The human body is an absolute master of resource allocation.
It really is.
It does not spend metabolic energy maintaining dense infrastructure that it doesn't think it needs. On Earth, the cells that break down bone called osteoclasts and the cells that build bone called osteoblasts are in this perfect balanced dance.
Right. But then you get to microgravity. You are in free fall. Your legs are suddenly just useless appendages floating behind you.
You're just pulling yourself around with your hands.
Exactly. You use your hands to pull yourself along Velcro straps and handrails on the walls. And that biological cheapskate inside you goes, oh, wait, we aren't fighting a constant downward force anymore. Excellent.
We can save so much energy.
Yes. Let's just shut down the osteoblasts and let the osteoclasts dissolve the skeleton.
And the sheer speed of this degradation is what shocks most people.
It's terrifying.
The source highlights that 4 months in space equates to roughly a 1% loss of mass in the spine per month.
1% per month. To put that in perspective for you, an elderly person on Earth suffering from severe osteoporosis might lose 1 or 2% of their bone mass in an entire year.
And astronauts are losing that in 30 days.
It's just wild.
And if you extrapolate that out for a theoretical journey to Mars, which could take anywhere from 6 to 9 months just in transit.
Just getting there.
Exactly. The structural integrity of the human frame is profoundly compromised before you even set foot on the Martian surface.
And it gets worse, right?
Oh, much worse. Because as the bone dissolves, all that calcium doesn't just vanish. It enters the bloodstream, massively increasing the risk of debilitating kidney stones.
Oh, man. Passing a kidney stone on Earth is agonizing enough.
Imagine passing one while trapped in a metal tube millions of miles from a hospital. It could be a mission-ending catastrophe.
And while your spine is actively dissolving, it is also literally stretching out.
Because of the lack of compression.
Right. Because gravity isn't constantly compressing your vertebrae and the little discs between them anymore. Your spine just expands. You actually get taller in space.
Which sounds like a fun novelty at first.
It does, until you realize it causes agonizing, stretching back pain.
The muscles and ligaments in the back are suddenly pulled taut in ways they were never biologically engineered to sustain.
There is a deeply illustrative, almost comical anecdote in the source material about this. It involves veteran astronaut Mike Mullane.
Oh, yes, the 1984 flight?
Yes. He was on a 1984 space shuttle flight, a crew of 6, 5 men and 1 woman, Dr. Judy Resnick.
Right.
And once they reached orbit and the zero-gravity environment took hold, all 5 of the men suffered severe, debilitating lower back pain from their spines lengthening.
Well, Dr. Resnick, fascinatingly, remained entirely pain-free.
Completely fine. Mullane actually recorded her reaction to the situation. He quotes her as saying, "I don't believe it. Here I am going to bed with 5 men, and they all have backaches."
It's a hilarious quote, but it really highlights how incredibly unpredictable the physiological responses to space can be.
It really does.
Like, why did the men suffer and she didn't? We still don't fully understand all the anatomical variables at play there.
And it gets so much weirder than just back pain. We have to talk about puffy-faced bird leg
A
syndrome.
very technical medical term.
I just love that the actual serious medical literature has adopted this term, puffy-faced bird leg syndrome.
It is incredibly descriptive, though, and it points to a massive failure in our cardiovascular adaptation.
So think about the mechanics of your heart. On Earth, your heart is a pump that has to work incredibly hard to push heavy blood all the way down to your feet, and then fight gravity to pull it all the way back up to your chest and head.
It's fighting a massive downward force every second of your life.
Right. But in space, that downward force vanishes. Yet your heart doesn't know that.
No, it's an autonomous muscle conditioned by a lifetime of gravity.
Exactly. So it keeps pumping with the exact same aggressive force, treating the blood as if it still weighs something.
The result is that all of your bodily fluids aggressively shift upward. They evacuate your lower extremities and just pool in your chest and your head.
Which results in the namesake syndrome. Your legs lose massive amounts of fluid volume and shrink down to little, spindly bird legs.
And meanwhile, all that excess fluid in your upper body causes your face to puff up like a swollen balloon.
It's such a bizarre image.
It is. And the baroreceptors in your neck, which measure blood pressure, suddenly think you have way too much fluid in your body because it's all crowded at the top.
So they panic.
Yes, they trigger your kidneys to start dumping plasma. You actually lose a significant percentage of your total blood volume.
And as veteran astronaut Susan Helms pointed out, this bizarre fluid shift has some weird, unexpected vanity benefits.
Sure.
Because you dump fluid volume, you lose weight. Because your face swells up, all your wrinkles completely fill out and disappear.
Like natural Botox.
Exactly. Your legs get incredibly skinny, and as we mentioned, your spine stretches out so you get taller. You essentially turn into an orbital supermodel.
A supermodel who, unfortunately, might immediately pass out the second they return to a gravity well.
Right, because of the orthostatic intolerance.
Exactly. Because after months of this, the cardiovascular system literally forgets how to constrict the blood vessels in the legs to manage blood flow against gravity.
So when you stand up on Earth,
All the blood just rushes straight to your feet, and your brain is starved of oxygen.
but this fluid shift isn't just a cosmetic quirk or a fainting risk, is it?
No, not at all. It leads to what might be the single most serious long-term consequence of spaceflight we've discovered so far.
Which is prominent vision damage.
This is truly terrifying. And it caught the medical community completely by surprise.
I can imagine.
Because that massive upward fluid shift doesn't just puff out your cheeks. It drastically increases the pressure inside the human skull.
Right. And your skull is a rigid sealed box. So when the intracranial pressure goes up, that pressure has nowhere to go.
So it pushes outward against the back of your eyeballs.
Oh, man.
It literally squishes the eyeballs flat from behind. It physically alters the spherical shape of the eye and crushes the optic nerve and the blood vessels feeding it.
That is horrifying. And the statistics on this from the source are incredibly sobering.
Very much so.
They note that in a comprehensive survey of 300 astronauts, 23% of those who went on short, 2-week shuttle missions reported permanent or long-lasting difficulty seeing things close up after returning to Earth.
But for those on longer duration International Space Station missions that last 6 months, that number jumped to a staggering 50%.
Half of them.
Yes.
Half of the highly trained, incredibly healthy people we send up there come back with permanent structural damage to their vision.
It's a massive problem.
And the source mentions this very specific, slightly depressing detail about how NASA handles this. This problem has become so universally common in astronauts over 40 that NASA doesn't even wait for the complaints anymore.
They just anticipate it.
Yeah, they preemptively prescribe them farsightedness spectacles before they even launch.
Yeah.
They are officially cataloged as space anticipation glasses. Or,
SAGs.
SAGs, an unfortunate acronym, but a very real, very mechanical medical countermeasure to a currently unsolved biological crisis.
Right.
We are literally sending people into an environment that crushes their organs, and our best solution so far is to hand them a pair of reading glasses.
It really puts the engineering marvel into perspective.
It does. And this brings us to what might be the most terrifying blind spot in this entire systemic analysis.
The data gap.
Exactly. Everything we have just discussed, the bone loss, the fluid shifts, the crushed optic nerves, is based on decades of medical data gathered from human beings living in microgravity. 0G.
Right. We have a lot of data on 0G. We've had stations up there for a long time. But here is the critical disconnect. Almost zero serious proposals for long-term space settlement envision humans living permanently in 0G space stations.
No, they always talk about the surface of a planet.
Right. They almost universally envision settlements on the surface of the moon, which has about 1/6 of Earth's gravity, or on the surface of Mars, which has about 2/5 of Earth's gravity.
And the amount of empirical data we have on how the human body adapts to partial gravity over long periods of time is, well, basically nothing. It is a complete void.
The source points out that our entire medical data set for lunar gravity consists of exactly 12 guys.
The Apollo astronauts.
Yes, who collectively spent less than a month on the moon half a century ago.
Which raises an incredibly important question. Perhaps the single most important question regarding human expansion into the solar system.
Which is whether partial gravity is enough.
Exactly. Is the low gravity of the moon or Mars Earth-like enough to trigger the body to maintain its skeleton and regulate its fluids?
Is 2/5 gravity enough to spare the body from dissolving its bones and crushing its eyeballs?
Or does the exact same physiological degradation happen just on a slightly slower timeline?
We literally do not know.
We don't. And I really want you, the listener, to stop and deeply imagine this scenario. Imagine you volunteer for a Mars colony.
Okay.
You take the 6-month flight, you land, and you spend 10 years building a life there. Your body slowly adapts to the 2/5 gravity. Your bones thin out significantly because they don't need to support as much weight.
Your heart muscle weakens because it doesn't have to work nearly as hard to pump blood.
Right. And then 10 years later, for whatever reason, a family emergency back home, a medical condition that needs Earth doctors, or just a profound, undeniable desire to see a blue ocean again, you try to come back.
And this is the terrifying part.
We do not know if you could physically survive the trip back down to Earth's surface.
It is entirely possible that your skeletal structure would have degraded to the point where re-entering Earth's atmosphere at multiple g-forces, or even just standing up on Earth's surface, would cause your bones to literally shatter under your own body weight.
Your heart might not be strong enough to pump blood to your brain.
It completely reframes the entire narrative, doesn't it?
It totally does. The grand engineering challenge of building a shiny, reusable rocket to get you to Mars is completely overshadowed by the stark biological reality that once you arrive, you might be trapped there forever, simply because your physical body has fundamentally changed.
You become a prisoner of the gravity well you chose to inhabit.
And if individual adult humans, at the absolute peak of physical fitness, are degrading at this rate, it forces us to confront the ultimate question for any proposed settlement.
Generational continuity.
Yes, because a settlement, by definition, implies permanence. It implies generations. You cannot sustain a civilization by purely importing 25-year-old adults from Earth every 2 years.
Eventually, you need biological continuity.
Which means a space settlement absolutely requires space babies.
Exactly. If you cannot establish generational continuity, you do not have a settlement. You just have an incredibly expensive, slowly dying remote outpost.
So if the individual body is constantly fighting a losing battle against the environment, how do you sustain a population? Let's transition into this generational bottleneck.
It's a massive hurdle.
Because this is where the biological reality slams headfirst into a massive, almost insurmountable ethical wall. But before we get into the heavy ethics, let's look at the pure mechanical physics of the situation.
Because making space babies requires
SpaceX.
Yes, and the physics of human intimacy in a microgravity environment present immediate, almost comical logistical challenges.
It's so funny to think about the scientists trying to solve this.
It all comes back to basic physics. Newton's third law states that for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. On Earth, gravity and friction anchor us. But in microgravity, when two free-floating bodies interact, that law becomes highly problematic. Any physical movement pushes the partners apart.
The source material is actually hilarious about how seriously aerospace engineers have taken this. They have literally drawn up conceptual blueprints to solve the physics of orbital intimacy.
They really have.
There's an early concept for something affectionately called a snuggle tunnel.
A snuggle tunnel.
Which is exactly what it sounds like. It's a padded, enclosed tube designed to keep two people in close proximity through sheer friction.
But the futuristic ideal.
Right. The futuristic ideal, proposed by an engineer back in the 1970s, was something dubbed the Space Chevy van.
A charmingly retro concept.
It was basically envisioned as a small, highly customized enclosed pod specifically designed for orbital delights, complete with handholds and foot restraints to defeat Newton's third law.
Because you have to strap in.
You do.
Yeah.
Well, the human drive to procreate is incredibly strong, regardless of how hostile or logistically complex the environment happens to be.
Very strong.
We mentioned Mike Mullane earlier with the bizarre backache anecdote. Well, he also went on the record in his memoirs about his libido while in orbit.
Oh, yes, this quote.
He famously stated that due to the extreme vasodilation and fluid shifts we discussed earlier, he woke up with an erection so intense it was practically painful.
He claimed, in his own very colorful words, that he could have drilled through kryptonite.
I mean, so the flesh is definitely willing. The biological drive doesn't turn off just because you leave the atmosphere.
The flesh is willing, but the physical environment is intensely, fundamentally hostile to the outcome of that act.
Which is where things get really dark.
Exactly.
Yeah.
This is where we must pivot from the humor of the mechanical logistics to the very dark, very severe reality of radiation and gestation.
Because space is not just empty.
No, it is utterly saturated with lethal radiation.
Down here on Earth, we are protected. Our thick atmosphere and our planet's massive magnetic field act as a giant, invisible shield that deflects the worst of the cosmos.
But the second you leave low Earth orbit and head for Mars, or set up camp on the surface of the Moon or Mars, that shield is entirely gone.
And we're not just talking about solar radiation, which can largely be blocked by relatively simple physical shielding, like water or lead.
No, we're talking about galactic cosmic rays, or GCRs.
Right.
These are incredibly fast, incredibly heavy atomic nuclei shooting across the universe at near the speed of light. When a GCR hits a strand of DNA, it acts like a microscopic bowling ball hitting pins.
It shatters the genetic sequence.
Exactly, it shatters it completely.
And radiation is the absolute enemy of cellular division. It destroys rapidly dividing cells.
Which means sperm, unfertilized eggs, and especially developing fetuses are the most vulnerable things imaginable in that environment.
Current NASA radiation limits for adult professional astronauts are incredibly strict for this exact reason.
And a realistic transit and return trip to Mars would expose a crew to radiation levels that far exceed the lifetime acceptable limits for NASA astronauts of any age or gender.
So what does this mean practically?
What this means structurally is that under current standard safety protocols, a Mars mission is essentially branded no humans allowed.
Wow.
A recent, highly detailed paper by the National Academy of Sciences reviewed this data and literally concluded that to send veteran astronauts to Mars, we wouldn't rely on advanced shielding.
What would we rely on?
We would have to deploy Earth's most powerful fundamental defense mechanism, a signed liability waiver.
A liability waiver. Like I, the undersigned, acknowledge that my DNA might be shredded by galactic cosmic rays, massively increasing my risk of terminal cancer, and I promise not to sue the agency.
Exactly.
But here is the insurmountable problem. You cannot get a developing fetus to sign a liability waiver.
No, you cannot.
How could we possibly ethically test human gestation in a high-radiation, low-gravity environment?
The short, brutal answer is we can't. Ethically, we just can't. To truly understand if a child can be successfully conceived, safely gestated, born and raised to healthy reproductive age in a partial gravity, high radiation environment, you would have to run multi-generational experiments on human subjects.
Which is horrifying.
And if the environment causes massive developmental abnormalities, if the lack of gravity means the fetus's heart doesn't develop properly, or the radiation causes severe neurological defects, you have actively condemned those children to a lifetime of unimaginable suffering for the sake of an experiment.
So because human testing is an ethical nightmare, we test on animals.
Yes.
And the source details some of the animal experiments that scientists have attempted to gather this data. And they range from the deeply tragic to the utterly bizarre.
They really do.
For example, there was a Russian space experiment a few years ago that sent a group of geckos up into orbit in a specialized satellite for some highly monitored zero-gravity mating.
A critical, if strange, experiment to observe reptilian reproductive biology in microgravity.
Right, but the life support system on the satellite failed, the heating units shut down, and the entire satellite basically became a freezing, orbiting gecko tomb. It was a complete disaster.
Tragic for the geckos and totally useless for the data.
But even more disturbing than the orbital failures are the experiments done right here on Earth, desperately trying to simulate low gravity for mammalian reproduction.
Because, as we established, you can't just turn gravity off in a laboratory.
Exactly. So researchers devised these hind limb suspension tests.
Oh, these are wild.
They literally take laboratory rats, attach harnesses to their tails, and hang them so their back legs dangle off the floor, supposedly simulating the weird, unweighted feeling of partial gravity.
But they immediately ran into a mechanical problem.
A very specific biological mechanical problem.
Right. When you hang a rat upside down by its tail for weeks at a time, its testicles succumb to gravity and physically sink up into its abdomen.
Which is a catastrophic failure for the experiment.
Because drawing the testicles into the body cavity drastically alters the temperature of the scrotum, thereby damaging the sperm and completely corrupting any data you might get regarding reproduction.
So to fix that problem, the researchers had to perform highly invasive surgery on the rats.
Right.
They literally operated on them to stitch things in place and maintain their testicles, as the literature calls it, intrascrotally.
Which introduces an entirely new massive variable into the data set.
I mean, obviously.
If you test the sperm of those rats later and find anomalies, or if they fail to reproduce, was it caused by the simulated gravity environment, or was it caused by the massive biological stress of undergoing complex testicular surgery while hanging upside down?
The data becomes incredibly muddy and almost entirely useless.
Exactly. It's that break-in X-ray machine we talked about. The environment is so intensely complex that you cannot isolate the variables.
And speaking of complex, extreme solutions, we have to talk about the centrifuge patent.
I-
Because some scientists and engineers are so deeply worried about the impossibility of normal fetal development without a 1G downward force, that someone actually filed a patent for a device specifically designed to strap a pregnant woman into a massive centrifuge for the duration of her pregnancy.
The mechanical logic behind it is sound, even if the human application is horrifying.
Right, the physics check out.
The idea is that the centrifugal force generated by spinning the woman in a circle would simulate a continuous Earth-like downward tug, overriding the microgravity environment and theoretically allowing for normal skeletal and organ development in the fetus.
She would just be strapped into a spinning carnival ride for 9 straight months, and the patent possibly even envisions her giving birth while the centrifuge is still spinning, because stopping it would remove the gravity.
It perfectly highlights the absolute lengths to which an engineering mindset will go to try and solve deeply complex biological problems with purely mechanical solutions.
Completely ignoring the human element.
It completely ignores the profound psychological trauma, the intense motion sickness, and the overall physiological toll on the mother.
Okay, I have to push back here. Or rather, I want to pose a massive paradigm-shifting question to you based on all of this.
Okay, let's hear it.
If the radiation shielding is too heavy to launch, and the gravity issues require spinning pregnant women in circles, are we basically looking at a future where Earth is treated solely as a spawning ground?
A spawning ground.
Think about it. Humanity lives, mines, and works on Mars. But because reproduction off-world is biologically impossible or ethically abhorrent, to have a family, you have to take a 9-month flight back to Earth.
Right.
You have your baby, you raise that child in 1G Earth gravity for 18 years until their skeleton is fully formed and hardened, and then you ship them out to the Mars colonies to work.
This raises an incredibly important, terrifying question about how basic scientific facts strictly dictate social and geopolitical outcomes.
Because it completely changes the power dynamic.
If human reproduction fundamentally proves impossible off-world, then any space settlement is fundamentally forever tethered to Earth. It can never be a fully independent civilization.
It can never be a true city on Mars.
Exactly. The political power dynamics will always overwhelmingly favor Earth, because Earth uniquely controls the sole means of producing the next generation of workers.
The biology strictly dictates the geopolitics.
It really does.
That is wild to think about. A permanent colony of imported labor. But let's play devil's advocate. Let's say, for the sake of argument, that we figure it all out.
Okay, let's assume we solve the biology.
The centrifuge works perfectly. The magnetic radiation shielding holds. The liability waivers are ironclad. The humans arrive on Mars. They miraculously survive the partial gravity without turning to dust, and they are ready to build a brand new world.
They still have one minor, persistent problem they have to deal with every single day.
They need to breathe, and they need to eat.
Right. Which transitions us smoothly into the third major systemic roadblock in our analysis, the ecological house of cards.
We are moving from the extreme fragility of human biology to the even more extreme fragility of the ecological systems required to keep those humans alive.
We take the Earth's biosphere completely for granted. It is massive, incredibly redundant, and deeply self-correcting over long periods of time.
Like if a forest burns down, the atmosphere doesn't instantly run out of oxygen.
Exactly. But when we talk about living on Mars, we are talking about creating a closed-loop life support system.
The closed loop.
The completely sealed artificial terrarium where every single atom of oxygen, every molecule of carbon, and every drop of water must be perfectly, endlessly recycled forever.
The source takes us through the fascinating history of humanity trying to build these closed loops, starting with the Soviet Union in the 1960s with their BIOS 1, 2, and 3 experiments in Siberia.
Right.
And the initial plan for feeding their cosmonauts in these sealed habitats was incredibly brutally stark. They were going to feed them pure algae.
From a purely mathematical, ecological standpoint, algae is remarkably efficient.
Oh, on paper, it's great.
It aggressively consumes carbon dioxide, produces high volumes of oxygen, and provides an incredibly dense source of base calories and protein. It is the perfect closed-loop organism.
Mathematically perfect, sure, but it's plant sludge. Imagine volunteering for the most dangerous mission in human history, flying to Mars, and your entire culinary existence for the rest of your life is eating bowls of green sludge.
It's not great for morale.
Thankfully, the Soviets realized this was a bridge too far for human morale. The source specifically notes that a purely vegetarian, algae-based diet was ultimately rejected by the designers because, and I quote directly from the source, Siberians must have their meat.
A perfect example of human cultural and psychological needs actively conflicting with ecological efficiency.
Because meat is so hard to produce.
Meat production is vastly more resource-intensive, requiring massive amounts of water, space, and caloric input compared to simple plant production.
So they compromised. They imported some meat from the outside, they grew some fast-yielding wheat and vegetables inside, and they managed to relatively stabilize the carbon dioxide levels using the algae vats.
But even then, there was a massive labor cost.
Yes, even with this partially open system, because they weren't fully recycling human solid waste, yet the cosmonauts were spending up to 20% of their waking hours just doing manual labor to maintain the system.
Pruning, harvesting, cleaning vats.
20% of your highly valuable, highly trained time, just ensuring you don't actively suffocate or starve to death in your own home.
And that was a relatively simple, small-scale system. To understand the true, terrifying complexity of a completely closed-loop ecology, we have to examine the granddaddy of them all.
Biosphere 2.
Biosphere 2.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Most people of a certain age vaguely remember Biosphere 2 as this massive, highly publicized 1990s science experiment out in the Arizona desert.
Right, the giant glass pyramid.
It was this stunning 3.14-acre glass greenhouse that cost between $300 and $400 million in today's money to build. It had a miniature ocean, a rainforest, a desert.
It was incredibly ambitious.
And the general assumption by the public is usually that NASA ran it as a rigorous preparation for a Mars base. But they didn't. NASA had nothing to do with it.
No, it was privately financed by a billionaire, Edward Bass, and it was entirely operated by a highly eccentric group called the Synergists.
The source describes the Synergists as an enigmatic counterculture technologist group that was heavily cult-adjacent.
Cult-adjacent is a good way to put it.
Their charismatic leader, a man named John Allen, selected the crew of 8 biospherians. But he didn't select them based on rigorous NASA psychological profiles or intense stress testing.
No, his selection process was very different.
He selected them by taking candidates on rugged eco-adventures through the Australian outback and sailing on massive concrete ships. It essentially boiled down to whether John Allen thought you had the right vibe and whether you were cool under pressure in the wilderness.
Which is wild because the psychological screening process is absolutely vital.
Right.
In a sealed, closed system, social cohesion is quite literally just as critical to survival as the mechanical oxygen scrubbers. If the crew turns on each other, the work doesn't get done, and the system fails.
And inside Biosphere 2, the social relations completely spectacularly broke down.
They really did.
The crew split into 2 bitterly opposed hostile factions who essentially stopped speaking to each other while trapped inside this glass pyramid.
But the intense social breakdown, the warring factions, that was absolutely nothing compared to the biological breakdown of the facility itself.
The biology is where it truly became a nightmare.
They sealed these 8 people inside, intending for them to live entirely off the land for 2 unbroken years. And it immediately became an absolute nightmare of cascading system failures.
First, the agriculture failed.
They couldn't grow enough food to sustain themselves.
The crew was forced to work 8 to 10-hour days, just doing grueling physical subsistence farming, hand-threshing wheat, tending to the crops, just trying to survive.
It became an incredibly dangerous caloric deficit. They were burning massive amounts of calories in physical labor just to grow fewer calories than they were expending.
Right. It was an agricultural death spiral. The source points out a deeply dark telling detail about this.
The cookbook.
Yes. One of the crew members, Sally Silverstone, later published a cookbook featuring the recipes they supposedly used inside the habitat. And opposite page 1 of this cookbook is a glossy photo of the 8 biospherians celebrating their 1-year anniversary inside the dome.
And they look terrible.
They look gaunt. Their clothes are hanging off them. They had lost an average of 16% of their body weight. They were literally slowly starving to death inside their $400 million state-of-the-art terrarium.
Starvation is a terrible fate. But the oxygen crisis they faced is what truly fundamentally demonstrates the unpredictable danger of a closed loop.
The oxygen crisis is fascinating.
In a perfect theoretical biological system, humans and animals breathe oxygen and exhale carbon dioxide, and plants consume that carbon dioxide and exhale oxygen. It's a perfect balanced dance.
But inside Biosphere 2, the dance stumbled.
It completely fell apart.
The oxygen levels inside the dome started steadily plummeting, and the carbon dioxide levels were skyrocketing.
Yeah.
And the crew is in there, completely exhausted from the farming, severely calorie deficient, and now they're becoming breathless.
The air is literally thinning out.
They develop sleep apnea. They are frantically taking cuttings and planting new ferns anywhere they can find a patch of direct sunlight, desperately trying to force the system to generate more oxygen.
It was a terrifying, deeply opaque, systemic failure.
Because nobody knew what was happening.
Exactly. The scientists monitoring from the outside were baffled. The oxygen was disappearing, but it wasn't showing up as equivalent levels of carbon dioxide. It was just vanishing.
And the root cause, when they finally diagnosed it, was something completely invisible.
The soil microbes.
When the designers engineered the facility, they chose incredibly rich, dark, high organic matter soil for the agricultural biomes to ensure high crop yields.
Because rich soil grows better crops. That makes perfect logical sense.
On the open earth, yes, it makes perfect sense. But in a sealed environment, it was a fatal miscalculation.
Because that rich soil was teeming with billions of microscopic bacteria and microbes.
Right.
And those microbes began vigorously consuming the oxygen in the air to metabolize the organic matter in the dirt, exhaling massive amounts of carbon dioxide. The soil respiration vastly outstripped the photosynthesis of the plants.
So the dirt itself was literally stealing their air. The ground they were walking on was suffocating them.
Precisely. But that only explains the carbon dioxide spike. It doesn't explain where the missing oxygen atoms went.
Right, the missing oxygen.
And that was the second, even more bizarre, systemic failure. The massive structural concrete foundations used to build Biosphere 2 hadn't fully cured when they sealed the doors.
And concrete curing is a slow chemical reaction.
Exactly. As the soil microbes pumped out excessive CO2, the calcium hydroxide in the uncured concrete chemically reacted with it, converting it into calcium carbonate.
So the concrete was literally absorbing the carbon dioxide.
Yes, effectively locking the oxygen atoms permanently out of the atmospheric cycle and into the walls of the building. The architecture itself was eating the atmosphere.
It's unbelievable. They ultimately had to pipe in fresh liquid oxygen from the outside in the middle of the night just to keep the crew from suffering permanent brain damage, essentially breaking the sealed, closed loop and ending the purity of the entire experiment.
It was a massive reality check.
So taking all of this and the algae sludge, the starving crew, the suffocating dirt, the oxygen-eating walls, what does this all mean for a permanent Mars settlement?
The systemic takeaway here is profoundly sobering. Down here on Earth, our biosphere is so massive, so incredibly vast, that ecological failure is almost always slow.
We have time.
We have a buffer. We can severely pollute a major river system or deforest thousands of acres of jungle, and it takes years, sometimes decades, for the full fatal consequences to manifest. We have time to react, to study, and to attempt to correct it.
But in a space terrarium, millions of miles away.
In a space terrarium, the margin of error is absolute zero. Ecological failure is not slow. It is exponential, widely unpredictable, and almost immediately fatal.
Because there's no backup.
Exactly. If a vital crop fails due to a fungal infection on Mars, you cannot import 1,000 tons of grain from a neighboring country to survive the winter. If the microscopic soil microbes suddenly bloom due to a temperature fluctuation and consume your oxygen, you are asphyxiating within days. There is no buffer.
It completely, utterly destroys the romanticized sci-fi vision of the space settler as this glorious, futuristic explorer gazing out over the Martian horizon in a pristine white jumpsuit.
The reality is much grimmer.
The grim reality is that a Mars settler is most likely going to be an exhausted, perpetually hungry, highly stressed goat herder and dirt farmer, trapped in a fragile glass bubble, praying to whatever gods they believe in that the invisible microbes in the soil don't decide to eat the atmosphere today.
It is a precarious, exhausting existence, and this extreme precarity brings us directly to the next structural layer of our analysis.
The legal layer.
Because when human lives are constantly hanging by a biological and ecological thread, the legal and institutional systems that govern their behavior, their disputes, and their resource allocation become a direct matter of life and death.
Right. Because you would logically assume that because space is so lethal and because a single mistake with an airlock or a water recycler could kill everyone in the settlement, the international community must have incredibly strict, watertight, universally agreed upon legal frameworks to maintain order and cooperation.
You'd think there would be massive treaties ensuring nobody does anything stupid.
Exactly. But the expert analysis in the book reveals that the exact opposite is true. We are entirely entering the legal Wild West.
If we look at the foundation of international space law, we have to start with the Outer Space Treaty of 1967.
Universally known as the OST.
Right, the OST. And at first glance, its primary directive is quite noble, the non-appropriation principle.
Which means no one can own it.
It strictly prohibits any sovereign nation from claiming territory over a celestial body. You cannot land on the moon, plant a flag, and legally declare, this crater is now the sovereign territory of the United States or Russia or China.
Which sounds fantastic. Space belongs to all of humanity.
Yeah.
Peace, harmony, and shared scientific discovery.
In theory, yes. But we must examine the historical context. The OST was drafted and signed in the late 1960s at the absolute height of the Cold War.
Right. Context matters.
The primary overriding motivation of the superpowers wasn't to regulate commercial asteroid mining or manage permanent lunar hotels. It was to prevent each other from putting nuclear weapons in orbit or building militarized missile bases on the moon.
It was an arms control treaty masquerading as an exploration framework.
Exactly. Consequently, because it wasn't designed for a future of private commercial spaceflight, aggressive resource extraction, and permanent competing corporate bases, it contains massive, highly dangerous legal loopholes regarding de facto control.
The source material lays out these loopholes perfectly with two hilarious but entirely legally accurate hypothetical scenarios.
The exploitation without sovereignty loophole.
Yes. First, let's talk about the loophole of exploitation without sovereignty. Because resources are everything. Water is going to be the absolute most precious resource in the solar system. You obviously need it to drink, you can split it to make oxygen to breathe, and you can synthesize it into rocket fuel to get home.
And we know there is some trapped ice at the moon's poles.
It is highly limited, incredibly premium real estate. The difference between landing near the ice and landing away from the ice is the difference between a viable base and a graveyard.
So under the rules of the OST, no one owns the moon.
Right. But say a private company goes up there, lands a massive mining rig in the Shackleton crater right on top of the best ice deposit, and builds a base we'll call Weinersmith.
Okay, Shackleton Station.
And then, just for fun, they decide to use a massive chunk of the moon's highly limited water supply to carve a gigantic, gravity-defying ice sculpture of their CEO.
Just wasting it.
Yeah. Are they legally allowed to do that under international law?
According to the current dominant legal interpretation of the treaty by space lawyers, probably yes.
That's crazy.
They aren't claiming sovereign ownership over the crater itself. They are merely exploiting the resource they found. The fact that they are frivolously wasting the most valuable survival resource in the solar system on a vanity ice sculpture is legally irrelevant under the OST.
Or, to push the absurdity even further, what if the United States government decides to send up a fleet of rovers and pave a massive 100-square-mile section of the lunar surface simply to build a giant parking lot?
Again, as long as the U.S. government doesn't explicitly pass a law claiming that the lunar parking lot is sovereign U.S. territory subject to U.S. constitutional law, it falls into a massive gray area.
So they could just do it.
Under the treaty, if another nation objects, the U.S. is required to offer a consultation to discuss the matter, but they aren't strictly legally forbidden from paving the regolith.
And then there's the second major loophole, which the book affectionately calls the Moon Canadians loophole.
This one is about de facto control.
And this is all about de facto, practical control. You can't legally own the land, but you are perfectly allowed to build a scientific base on it. So, say the Canadians land on the very best, most accessible spot of water ice on the lunar South Pole, and they build a massive base.
Right.
And they broadcast to the world, hey everyone, just to be clear, this isn't sovereign Canadian land. However, we have incredibly sensitive, highly delicate scientific equipment running here to detect moonquakes. So for safety reasons, we are requesting that everyone else please stay out of a 100-mile radius so you don't vibrate the ground and disturb our crucial experiments.
And they could theoretically put up a sign on the perimeter saying, "Delicate experiment in progress, visiting hours resume in 10,000 years."
Exactly. It's sovereignty in everything but name.
Hmm.
They don't own the deed to the land, but they are absolutely effectively hoarding the premium real estate and legally keeping everyone else out.
It's a huge loophole.
And this isn't just hypothetical science fiction thought experiments. The expert analysis in the source shows how incredibly tense political maneuvering is happening right now, today, to solidify these exact loopholes into binding international law.
We must look at the current actions of major spacefaring governments here.
The U.S. in particular.
Right. The United States, for instance, has been actively working for years to establish binding legal precedents that heavily favor aggressive, unrestricted commercial resource extraction.
Like the dirt contract.
Yes. A few years ago, NASA engaged in a highly specific contractual maneuver. They contracted private commercial space companies to fly to the moon, scoop up a small handful of lunar dirt, and then officially transfer legal ownership of that scooped dirt to NASA in exchange for a token financial fee.
In one specific case, the contract awarded was for precisely $1.
Precisely $1.
Which is absurd on its face. NASA obviously does not physically need a single dollar's worth of random moon dirt. They have hundreds of pounds of it sitting in vaults from the Apollo missions.
No, the physical dirt is entirely irrelevant. The legal transaction itself is what matters.
The press is.
Exactly. As the NASA administrator at the time explicitly stated to the press, the entire goal of the mission was to establish a legal precedent. In international law, customs, norms, and precedents matter deeply.
So by buying it.
By officially buying that extracted dirt from a private entity, NASA is deliberately establishing the international norm that private companies have the absolute right to extract, own, and sell space resources for profit without violating the non-appropriation clause of the OST.
The source also notes that in 2020, the Trump administration signed an executive order flat out rejecting the long-held philosophical idea that space is a global commons.
A legal concept called res nullius.
Right, which implies that the resources belong to all of humanity collectively. The executive order basically asserted that Americans, both public and private, have the inherent right to exploit space resources without international limitation and personally own the results.
And following that,
Following that, the U.S. introduced the Artemis Accords, leveraging their massive space budget to try and get allied nations to sign on and agree to these new extraction-friendly norms.
and this brings us to a deeply chilling geopolitical reality.
The Thucydides trap.
If we synthesize all these legal loopholes, the scramble for resources, and the lack of strict international governance, we arrive at a scenario that strongly resembles a modern orbital version of the Thucydides trap.
Okay, let's break that concept down, because it sounds exactly like what happens when an emerging power threatens an established one, and the friction inevitably leads to a massive clash.
Yes.
The original theory comes from the ancient Greek historian Thucydides detailing the Peloponnesian War, right?
Precisely. The theory argues that when a rapidly rising power like Athens back then, or China today, threatens to displace an established ruling power like Sparta then, or the U.S. today, the resulting structural stress almost inevitably leads to violent conflict.
And now apply that to space.
Now apply that volatile geopolitical dynamic to the vacuum of space. We have multiple heavily armed nuclear-capable powers, the U.S., China, Russia, all aggressively eyeing a highly limited, physically concentrated pile of premium resources on the moon.
Like the ice deposits hidden in the craters at the poles, or helium-3, which is an isotope trapped in the lunar jote that could theoretically be mined and shipped back to Earth to power incredibly clean nuclear fusion reactors.
It is the ultimate multi-trillion-dollar energy goldmine.
Exactly. The stakes are astronomically high. And to manage this competition, we have a vague, outdated 1960s legal framework that essentially operates on a first-come, first-served basis.
The treaty effectively says the first one to exploit the resource gets to keep it, and you can establish a keep-out zone around your operation.
Which is terrible.
This is a catastrophically misaligned incentive structure. It practically forces competing nations to rush headlong into a crisis.
Right, because if you don't grab it, someone else will.
It incentivizes cutting corners on safety, acting recklessly fast, planting your base, and claiming de facto control over the ice or the helium-3 before international governance can catch up and stop you. It is a textbook recipe for rapid escalation and conflict.
The source actually quotes a former NASA administrator admitting this exact paranoid fear regarding China's rapidly advancing lunar presence. The administrator explicitly said to the press, "We have to be concerned that they would say, 'This is our exclusive zone, you stay out.'"
The fear is very real.
So we are actively setting up a scenario where nuclear-armed superpowers are going to be scrapping over a tiny frozen puddle of water on a dead rock millions of miles from home. Is there a better way? Is there any historical precedent or alternative to this orbital Wild West?
The authors detail a very compelling, functioning alternative down here on Earth, the Antarctic Treaty System, or the ATS.
Antarctica.
If you think about it, Antarctica is a massive, completely unknown continent covered in ice with strong geological evidence of incredibly valuable minerals and oil buried deep under the surface.
Just like the moon.
During the height of the Cold War, it could easily have become the site of a massive, violent, militarized resource scramble between the U.S. and the Soviets.
But it wasn't. Nobody fought a war over Antarctica. Why?
Because the international community sat down and agreed to treat it as a true, protected global commons. It was dedicated exclusively to peaceful scientific research.
And crucially, in 1998.
Yes, in 1998, a strict 50-year moratorium on all mining and resource extraction went into effect. Under the ATS, you cannot mine in Antarctica. You cannot drill for oil. You cannot even explore or survey the land to see if there are minerals to mine later.
The source has this genuinely funny but highly effective flowchart for illustrating the Antarctic resource extraction regime. It's just a starting box that says want to mine in Antarctica with an arrow pointing to a single dead-end box that just says no.
It is highly restrictive, it is immensely bureaucratic, and frankly, compared to the thrilling gold rush narrative of space mining, it is incredibly boring.
But boring is good.
Boring is very good because it ensures total peace. The authors strongly argue for adopting a Space-Arctica approach for the Moon and Mars.
So trading the gold rush for peace.
Trading the explosive, high-risk potential of unrestricted corporate resource exploitation for medium-term geopolitical peace. Their argument is essentially, let's institute a moratorium and wait until humanity has its political, legal, and technological act together before we start aggressively carving up the solar system for profit.
But let's assume we don't do that, because human history suggests we rarely choose the boring, peaceful route when there's money to be made.
Sadly true.
Assuming the Artemis Accords, the private mining contracts, and the aggressive gold rush mentality win out. If international law allows megacorporations to extract resources and set up private bases, what happens to the actual everyday person?
The workers.
The engineer, the miner, the botanist who actually signs the contract and goes to work in these off-world extraction colonies. This brings us to the final and in many ways most claustrophobic and terrifying systemic layer economics.
If the overarching legal structure allows private entities to govern celestial extraction, the foundational economic structure of these early settlements is almost guaranteed to default to a historical model we are very familiar with.
The company town.
The company town.
Right. And to truly understand what a company town means for human rights, we have to look back at brutal labor history. We look at places like Corner Brook in Newfoundland or the sprawling Appalachian coal mining towns in the United States during the late 19th and early 20th centuries.
These weren't just normal towns where a massive company happened to be the largest employer.
No, the distinction is critical. The company didn't just operate in the town. The company was the town.
Exactly. The corporation owned the coal mine you worked in, yes. But they also owned the physical house your family slept in.
They owned the only grocery store in a 50-mile radius.
They paved the roads, they funded the schools, they issued their own private currency called company scrip, which was only valid at the company store, effectively trapping you in debt.
And most importantly, they hired and controlled the local police force. They were your boss, your landlord, your grocer, and your city council, all rolled into one singular profit-driven entity.
And history unequivocally tells us that this extreme concentration of economic and civic power invariably leads to profound systemic labor abuses.
It's inevitable.
When the exact same corporate entity you're negotiating your hourly wages with is the exact same entity that can legally evict your family from their home in the dead of winter, the power imbalance is near absolute. The worker has no leverage.
The source brings up a terrifying, bloody historical example to illustrate how far this can go: the Battle of Blair Mountain in West Virginia in 1921.
A very dark chapter.
The conditions in the coal company towns were so brutal, so oppressive, that the miners finally organized, unionized, and went on a massive armed strike. And the company didn't just negotiate.
No, they fought a war.
They hired private detective agencies, essentially private armies, to break the strike. It escalated into a literal armed conflict, a miniature civil war, where the company actually hired private biplanes to drop makeshift bombs and tear gas on their own striking civilian workers.
And it brings us directly to what we can call the space environment multiplier.
So what does this all mean? Take that history of exploitation and move it to Mars.
It means we are taking a historical economic structure fundamentally known for brutal exploitation and violence, and we are placing it into a poisonous, lethal hellscape.
Because of labor mobility.
The critical economic factor here is what labor economists call labor mobility.
Labor mobility is essentially your ultimate trump card as a worker. It's your ability to say, I've had enough of this, quit your job, pack up your car, and go find a different employer in a different town.
Exactly. On Earth, even in the absolute worst, most isolated Appalachian coal town, labor mobility was never truly mathematically zero.
You could always leave.
If conditions became completely intolerable, if the abuse was too much, a striking miner could theoretically always walk away. They could sneak out in the night and hop a freight train out of town. They could walk into the woods and eventually find another civilization.
But on Mars, there are no freight trains. There are no woods to walk into. The source details the absolute terrifying reality of zero labor mobility in a Martian company town.
You are trapped.
If you are an employee of Moscow or whatever mega corporation owns the extraction settlement and they slash your wages or double your work quota, you can't just quit. Where are you going to go?
Yeah.
Outside into the freezing carbon dioxide atmosphere.
You are literally tens of millions of miles from the nearest alternative employer. Furthermore, your ability to return home is dictated by strict orbital mechanics.
Right, the launch windows.
Earth and Mars align for a viable, fuel-efficient launch window only once every 26 months. And even when that narrow launch window finally opens, the only rocket on the launch pad capable of making the journey is owned, operated, and ticketed by the exact same corporation you were trying to strike against.
And it gets even worse. On Earth, the coal company owned your house and your food. But you could still step out onto your front porch and breathe the free air.
But on Mars?
On Mars, the corporate infrastructure and utility workers aren't just keeping the electric lights on. They are actively mechanically controlling the precise mixture of oxygen and carbon dioxide in your bedroom while you sleep.
The company literally owns the biosphere. They own the atmospheric pressure.
I really want you to think deeply about this power imbalance. Put yourself in those boots. You are a blue-collar worker on a Mars extraction base.
Oh.
The life support systems are aging and degrading, the daily work quotas in the mines are becoming physically impossible, and you and your crew want to organize a union to demand fair treatment and safety upgrades.
A totally reasonable demand on Earth.
Exactly. But how do you possibly negotiate with a corporate boss who, with the simple flick of a digital switch in a control room, can slowly dial down the oxygen and dial up the carbon dioxide in your living quarters until the entire striking workforce becomes lethargic, highly compliant, or permanently dead?
You can't.
Exit is biologically impossible. A strike is literally suicide.
It transforms the basic transactional economic relationship of employment into a totalizing system of inescapable control.
Total control.
Without multiple competing employers, without independent, redundant life support systems, and without robust, accessible transport infrastructure back to Earth, the workers have absolutely zero leverage. The corporation achieves total dominion over the biological functions of its workforce.
So, step back and look at the whole picture we've painted today. We've gone from the inescapable biological reality of your bones dissolving and your optic nerves being crushed.
To the ecological nightmare.
Right, the ecological nightmare of starving and suffocating in a closed glass bubble because the dirt betrayed you.
To the geopolitical threat of nuclear-armed superpowers fighting over frozen lunar puddles.
All the way to the terrifying economic reality of being trapped millions of miles from home in a corporate dictatorship where the boss literally owns your lungs.
When you lay it out sequentially like that, it represents a profound overlapping convergence of systemic risks.
And this brings us to the ultimate summary of our entire deep dive today. Space settlement for decades has been universally sold to the public as this grand, inspiring, almost inevitable timeline of engineering achievements.
Right. The narrative is always, we just need bigger rockets, cheaper launch costs, and better 3D printers, and the rest will naturally sort itself out.
But as the meticulous analysis in the source material proves, that engineering-centric narrative completely obscures the truth.
To put it bluntly, the engineering is the easy part. Building the rocket is simple math compared to the rest of it.
Exactly.
The real crisis is that space settlement is a deeply complex, incredibly fragile socio-technical system. It requires radical biological adaptation that we aren't even sure is physically possible.
We really don't know.
It requires a level of ecological mastery and closed-loop perfection that we do not currently possess. And it requires legal and economic frameworks that prioritize universal human rights over monopolistic corporate profit, which, as human history consistently shows us, is rarely the default outcome when vast amounts of wealth are on the line.
So why do we completely ignore all of this? Why is the broader public, and even incredibly smart investors, so deeply obsessed with the shiny rockets and so utterly blind to the structural biological reality?
The authors forcefully argue that it all comes down to the pervasive, deeply ingrained narrative of the Plan B.
Ah, yes. Plan B. The popular cultural idea that Earth is ultimately doomed, whether by climate change, nuclear war, or asteroid strike, so we absolutely must colonize Mars to serve as a backup hard drive for human consciousness.
Exactly. Framing space settlement as an immediate existential survival imperative for the entire species is incredibly dangerous.
Because it shuts down debate.
It gives the endeavor a false, overwhelming moral urgency. It creates a narrative where any delay, any call for caution or regulation is framed as an existential threat to humanity's future.
Right.
And that intense moral urgency aggressively overrides rational structural analysis. Blind technological optimism becomes an acceptable substitute for unresolved biological and institutional uncertainty.
We rush toward the launch pad simply because we feel an apocalyptic need to leave.
Completely ignoring the fact that we are wholly, systemically unprepared for what actually happens when we land.
This is the ultimate crisis in perception, and it's exactly why we wanted to bring you this specific deep dive today. Because the broken, unstable systems we are actively trying to export to Mars.
The massive legal loopholes, the exploitative monopolistic economics.
The desperate struggle to balance infinite human consumption with highly fragile, finite ecology. These are the exact same broken systems we are currently struggling, and often failing, to manage right here on Earth.
It is the great illusion of the frontier. Wherever humanity goes, we pack our unresolved socio-technical problems in our luggage and take them with us.
We really do.
Expanding into a highly lethal, utterly unforgiving environment does not miraculously solve these problems. The hostility of the environment merely amplifies them to life or death stakes.
Which leaves us with a final, highly provocative thought to mull over.
Yes.
We constantly look up to the stars, and our science fiction conditions us to dream of boundless freedom. We dream of escaping the bureaucratic constraints of our homeworld to find a wild new frontier where we can make our own rules. But if the reality of these extreme hostile space environments requires absolute, rigid, totalitarian control over every single breath of air, every recycled drop of water, and every physical movement of every worker just to stave off instant ecological death,
Yeah.
then we have to ask a dark question.
What's the cost?
Right. If we cannot alter the hostile environment of Mars to suit our fragile biology, will the only way to truly conquer the stars be to artificially alter our own DNA? Will the first true, permanent inhabitants of Mars even be legally classified as human? Or will they have to be genetically engineered chimeras just to survive the gravity and radiation?
It's a terrifying thought.
And if that's the cost of entry, does the dream of escaping Earth to find total freedom actually guarantee the creation of the most absolute, biologically controlled, totalitarian societies humanity has ever conceived?
It is a chilling, profound paradox to consider as we watch the rockets launch.
And on that heavy note, we want to thank you for joining us on this journey. Crisis in Perception examines how invisible systems shape our deepest beliefs and how building better analytical tools helps us see the world and our future more clearly.
This project is entirely free and publicly accessible.
But if you value this kind of deep systems-level analysis, you can support the time, tools, and massive research behind crisis and perception by becoming a supporter on our Patreon.
Also, if you want a shorter visual overview of the complex orbital mechanics and biological failures we discussed today, check out the mini explainer linked in the description.
And finally, if you enjoyed this deep dive, please like, subscribe, and drop a comment, letting us know what books, topics, or invisible systems you'd like us to explore next.
Until next time, keep questioning the systems around you and look past the shiny engineering to see the fragile biology underneath.
So as you go about your day-to-day, take a deep, long breath of Earth's free atmosphere, be glad you don't have to pay a CEO for the privilege, and catch you next time.